My speech is entitled, The Poison of the Snake. In a world less perfect than ours, there are 3 houses that stand on top of an ashy mountain. Each one is placed 100 feet higher than the other. Down below reside those who lived in our world and now spend eternity screaming in agony for the pain they caused on our earth. They are unaware of anyone else, and yet they still envy everyone. Well, everyone except the residents living on the heated rubble. For in these houses live 3 decreated men who have been melted and destroyed to the state of almost nothingness, their limbs and overall structure hardly identifiable. In short, one could describe the forms of these beings as the same in nearly every meaning of the word. But besides their looks, these 3 men have next to nothing in common, for on earth they lived entirely separate lives. 2 died kings, while the other, an officer next in rank to a lieutenant. King A lived a mostly happy, satisfying life, acquiring all his desires, but losing it all soon before death. King B, on the other hand, was deformed even since birth and was always mistreated until his kingship. And the officer we know nothing about, aside from the fact that he lived the end of his life feeding on the ruin and unhappiness of others. Given the circumstances, it is easy to discern which one is morally worse than the other. But suppose I reveal that King A took the throne from his brother by killing him, blamed a venomous snake, then proceeded to quickly wed his brother's wife, who was not hesitant in the marriage. And when suddenly confronted, he feels the guilt and attempts to kill his nephew, the one who accused him. His scheme eventually ends in his own death. King B grows jealous of his older and more noble brothers and willingly chooses to become the villain of his story and kill all of his family to get the throne. These situations surely sound more vile than loving unhappiness, except the officer far exceeds these evils. One day, he suddenly plots to ruin his commander-in-chief simply because he has too many good things. He exposes his commander's unblessed marriage, but the matter resolves itself, so he then tries an alternate approach. He befriends his commander and slowly plants the idea that the commander's wife is unfaithful to him, while also setting up certain situations to make the evidence seem clear. This leads to chaos and absolute madness. The commander chooses to murder his wife while she sleeps, while she too intends to kill herself, seeing no other way to persuade her husband of the truth. Everyone eventually is dead, while the officer stands laughing over their cold, dead bodies. These characters are 3 of William Shakespeare's most infamous villains. King A is Claudius from Hamlet. King B is Richard III, while the officer is Othello's Iago. Iago is unlike Shakespeare's other villains, for he is the most vile villain in all of Shakespeare's plays, and one of the most vile villains in all of classic literature. Even though we see characters such as these as wicked, evil, or even villainous, do we ever consider what defines a villain, what it takes to be one, or how to discern a true villain from the mean old lady next door? Webster's dictionary defines a villain as a character whose evil actions or motives are important to the plot, or the person responsible for specified trouble, harm, or damage. Whenever we hear the word, we think of popular anti-heroes such as the Joker, Loki, or Darth Vader. Villains who are driven by some past event to destroy those who did them wrong, who disguise themselves as someone else to acquire what they will, or maybe average men who discover their true villainous identity after putting on the mask of villainy. In his Poetics, Aristotle says, a villain must have qualities that invoke fear and pity. And modern literary critic Stanley Hyman elaborates and says that on an English stage, a villain must use deceit and hypocrisy to mislead his dupes, and have a proud candor regarding his real nature and intentions in asides or soliloquies. In terms of ranking these villains, one must have a hierarchy of misdeeds in terms of least harmful to most. Dante Alighieri, in his Inferno, uses both biblical text as well as the doctrine of medieval church to form a hierarchy of 9 sins and their allotted punishments. First is limbo, where the virtuous pagans roam. Then the sins of the lustful, gluttonous, miser, and spendthrifts. Next is wrathful, the heretics and the violent. And finally, the harshest punishments fall on those who are frauds and traitors, who remain neck-deep in ice. But the worst of these traitors, such as Judas Iscariot or Brutus, are in the lowest parts of hell, forever being chewed in the mouth of Satan. Many poets, like Shakespeare, living during the time of Dante's popularity, would be familiar with this hierarchy of judgment. That is why Shakespeare portrays many of his villains as wrathful, violent fraud betrayers. Iago is one of these villains, for he plays a double role in the plot. He acts as a villain in disguise, twisting words, conceiving new schemes, and deceiving Othello to believe his wife is cheating with him with a good friend of his. But he also acts as a friend to Othello, giving him good counsel and information. When alone, he reveals his wicked schemes while never giving any motivation for ruining Othello's life. Eventually, the house of Othello and company are thrown into such a state of disarray, no one is considered trustworthy. Madness and skepticism result in Othello culminating in an attempt to murder his wife and ultimately suicide. Many of Othello's guests are also murdered, including Iago's wife Emilia, while Iago is merely sent to prison. And this is what cultivates fear in the minds of the audience, as well as pity for everyone who stood in his way. To those who read Shakespeare and share a strong passion for his plays, it will seem clear why many people agree that Iago is Shakespeare's most vile villain, and therefore placed in the lowest part of hell. For the way in which Iago deceives, by means of betrayal, is a far greater crime both in the realm of Shakespeare and Christianity. And unlike many villains, he lacks both a rational motive for doing wrong, as well as a conscience. With the exception of a few, most villains remain in their villainous state throughout their story, unless in certain instances there is a redemption moment at the end. They all have a backstory, a motive, and somehow acquire the means to do harm to others. DC Comics' The Joker, a criminal deformed by chemicals, has an obsession with Batman. He views Batman as ideal, and so he does whatever it takes to ruin Batman's life. Marvel's Loki perpetually opposes his brother Thor because he is tired of living in Thor's shadow. Maintaining one's evil is key to being a worthy villain. One is considered a lesser villain if they convert from good to evil or even evil back to good. Otherwise, a villain cannot be respected by his peers and lacks the authority he needs. But can one be considered more villainous if they are both good and evil to their villains? Certainly a villain who is two-faced to his opponents gains the upper hand so that their victims trust and respect him, only to be destroyed at the end. Iago is one of these two-faced villains. On the one hand, Iago befriends Othello, working as his agent, giving him good counsel. But on the other, he plots to ruin him and take his possessions away. He has no need to allow the audience to figure it out for themselves, because he clearly states, "The more already changes with my poison. Dangerous conceits are in their natures poison, but which are scarce found to distaste, but with little act upon the blood, burn like mines of sulfur." It brings him satisfaction to deceive Othello in both being a friend and a foe. What makes Iago stand out from the rest is that he says and does things that seem to have no true motive behind them, except for mere hatred. But even this hatred is not known to Iago's audience. Harold Bloom suggests that Iago is merely out for mischief, rousing up Brabantio, Desdemona's father, and conjuring up street brawls. But this does not satisfy Hymen when he writes Iago some approaches to the illusion of his motivation. His primary thesis is that Iago as a character has no motivation, but as a person he does. Hymen's first approach is historical and compares him to other plays around Shakespeare's time. He says, what motivates Iago is the need to war perpetually against love and happiness, truth and virtue, harmony and beauty, and all other manifestations of order and value. According to his definition of a villain, Iago reveals everything to the audience except his motive, which makes him seem more mysterious. In one of his monologues, he gives only petty reasons for ruining Othello. Taking over his office, he is too familiar with his wife and is of a free and open nature. While these jealousies may cause one to have wicked thoughts, they cannot be the only motives for causing so much strife in a household. Finally, Hymen makes the claim that Iago is a figuration of Satan. Although this seems a bit far-fetched and a wild connection, when we think of it in context, it may become clear. Within the first few hundred lines of the play, Iago says aside, though I do hate him as I do hell pains, yet for necessity of life, I must show out of a flag and sign of love, which is indeed but sign. Here he seems to be going through the motions without any emotions involved. But the majority of Shakespeare's characters, or specifically villains, always show guilt or shame, whether it changes them or not. Lady Macbeth drives herself mad as she tries to scrub the vile blood from her hands. Richard III dreams of his victims visiting him to warn him of his tragic fate. Guilt and shame are parts of the human response to immoral behavior. Therefore, Iago must not be human and must be some other vile creature without a moral conscience, a figure that is similar to Satan. Bloom agrees in saying that Milton's Satan from Paradise Lost falls just below Iago in terms of wickedness. He says that Iago was not able to bring down the supreme being and resorted to tempting Adam and Eve, while Iago's supreme being is Othello, who is easily persuaded by him. There are many other references in Othello where Iago puts on the form of Satan, or at least a demon. After Iago has been exposed of his villainy by his wife, Othello says, I look down toward his feet, but that's a fable. If that thou beest a devil, I cannot kill thee. Othello tries to stab Iago while he responds, I bleed, sir, but not killed. Even at the concluding lines of the play, everyone has either been killed or killed themselves, while Iago stays silent. And when his time for punishment comes, he is simply arrested. He never gets the death penalty he so rightly deserves. And so, with his sly, slithering, serpentine tongue, it is easy to see why Iago as the serpent in the garden. Therefore, it can be said that the closer a villain's characteristics are to the most corrupt being, Satan, especially if he succeeds him, should be deemed the most vile of villains. Because of this, it can be said that Iago is in the lowest part of hell with Judas, or maybe being the mouth that chews him instead of Satan. Now, for those Shakespearean scholars out there, you may be wondering, what about Richard III, who killed his entire family for the throne, only to lose it for lack of a horse? Or maybe you are thinking, well, Claudius killed his brother and had an illicit incestuous relations with his sister-in-law. And I do agree with these sentiments to a point. Both of these villains are truly wicked, and I am certain their place would be held somewhere in Dante's Inferno. But even so, Iago surpasses them both. Richard III, like Iago, reveals truths to the audience that the other characters do not see, and manages to deceive his dupes, or at least the feminine dupes. After he seduces Lady Anne, who accuses him of killing her husband, he says, "I'll have her, but I will not keep her for long. What, I that killed her husband and his father?" He also pretends to be a good man to his nephews and brothers, but unfortunately, his acting skills are far too transparent, and he is still mistrusted and seen by all parties as the villain throughout the play. And finally, the biggest attribute that separates Richard from Iago is that he at least is purposeful in having a power-hungry motive. He has a goal in mind and stops at nothing to get the throne. According to Dante, Richard would probably be placed in the ninth circle, but would be neck deep in ice with the other betrayers to their homeland. Claudius has the same motive as well, except he also shows a bit of humanity when he grows uncomfortable at the play Hamlet produces. He has guilt, while Richard nor Iago show any remorse for their actions. In the eyes of villainy, this is cowardice and unacceptable. And when he drinks from the poisoned chalice and dies, Claudius becomes just an ordinary villain with a scheming mind and lust for power. Iago, however, is the perfect villain who escapes the fate that he would have so well deserved, death. Claudius would be just above Richard and Iago in hell and be with the traitors to their kin. In Confessions, St. Augustine condemns himself for stealing pears without reason. He says that if he had at least some small reason for stealing, it would be easier to ask for forgiveness. Claudius and Richard at least have some form of humanity and morality, so that they have a strong, rational purpose for killing and deceiving. And naturally, their human conscience leads them to feel guilt and plead for God's mercy, whether it was sincere or not. But Iago never shows this shame and never tells of his motive. And like all villains, their end is death. But Iago manages to escape this deserved punishment. In today's culture, we watch movies like the Dark Knight trilogy, Star Wars, and Thor. We watch them and we observe their villains. But the strange thing is, we laugh at them. We imitate them and let them be a public icon for our lives. Is it because we aspire to be a sick, delusional psychopath with a creepy laugh and go around robbing banks and such? Do we go to our rooms and practice using the Force on our stuffed animals in hopes to rule the dark side? Although some may agree, I am convinced that we see the villains to subconsciously become aware of their attributes, but on a much larger, dramatic Hollywood scale. The blessing that comes with reading about Shakespeare's villains, or any villain, is to learn how to avoid the temptation of evil, even in our thoughts. Many people see Iago as a unnatural character, and his actions are not relatable to the average human. Bloom, however, quoting Hazlitt, states that Shakespeare creates him to emphasize and exaggerate what it's like to not be under the restraint of humanity or moral obligation. We see the implications of doing wrong and evil, and therefore choose the alternative. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to continue reading Shakespeare's plays such as Hamlet, Richard III, Othello, and others to see the outcome of evil and flee from it. For in a world such as this, darkness and evil are never rewarded in the final end, but the light will always prevail. Thank you.